Hi, and thank you for tuning into Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Black Hollywood, They've Gotta Have Us. Black Hollywood, They've Gotta Have Us is a 3-part television miniseries about the history of Black actors and filmmakers in Hollywood. Directed by Simon Frederick, the series features commentary and insight from actors, directors, and others involved in the making of films. They discuss not only specific notable films and roles, but also a more bird's-eye view of how the landscape has changed and also remained the same for Black people in Hollywood. The documentary begins with the premise of celebrating some of the major moments, achievements, and accomplishments of Black entertainers within the film industry. So actors, actresses, directors, and such within the film industry that have taken place during the last few years. I remember years ago, it was a really big deal when Denzel Washington and Halle Berry won Best Actor and Best Actress at, I believe it was the Oscars. I think it was the early 2000s, right? Denzel became the second Black actor to win the award for Best Actor, as Sidney Poitier had been the first, but that was several decades earlier. Halle Berry became the first to receive the award for Best Actress. And what was significant about this is that by this time, the film industry had been around for 90 or so years. The Academy had been around for a few decades less than that. But in that time, it took several decades, generations really, for Black people to receive the top honors. And at this point in time, I don't think that any Black person had won for Best Director or Best Screenplay, Motion Picture, things like that. So those other top categories. So with these two winning, it was regarded as a tremendous achievement. And, that was great because they gave great performances in both of their movies. And there's been some arguments about the politics behind the type of films and the type of roles that Black actors and actresses had to play, right? There was quite a bit of dust up a few years ago about the lack of nominations for actors and actresses as well as Black films on a whole. And I remember a few years ago, there was the campaign of the Oscars So White, which was sort of bringing attention to the lack of diversity, the lack of Black people being nominated that year. Now, being quite fair, my understanding of it was that this kind of started off as a thing, or part of the push was that I believe Will Smith had starred in some kind of movie and didn't receive any recognition for it from the award bodies. Putting aside all of the drama of this year, right? He's been in some great films. I enjoy his movies for the most part, his blockbusters especially. But if we're being honest, the last few years, his movies have not been particularly good, or at least not of any real interest to me. And I say this at this point, having not seen King Richard, but intending to watch it at some point. My feeling at the time was that it's not so much I was in support of the gist of the protest, which is lack of recognition for Black people's contributions to the film industry. But some of the people that were protesting, they had no problems attending in years past when no Black people had been nominated then. It was in the grand scheme of things, it's nice to be nominated, but it's great to win. Sometimes some of the films that are nominated, when I watch, because I watch a lot of movies, even beyond what I review here, and when I look at what's nominated and what people are talking about around award season, I tend to try to work my way through those films. Sometimes some of them, the attention that they receive is certainly well-deserved. And other times it's I'll watch and I don't really understand why, a particular film has won so many awards, because I don't think it's that good. These people had no issues attending these award shows just the year before and the years leading up to the Oscar So White situation, right? And then suddenly you have an issue that year when you or your loved one has a project out and either it's not nominated or it doesn't win. It kind of seemed like you're taking your personal issue or your feeling of entitlement to recognition and fussing about it, right? Trying to turn it into a problem for the Black community. Now, granted, I think the lack of recognition, the lack of opportunities for Black actors, actresses, and other people involved in the film industry is certainly a legitimate concern and a valid complaint. It's a valid point, but rather I took issue with the people that were making the complaint, right? Because they weren't complaining in years past when they were nominated or when they were getting attention, right? It's the circumstances under which they were making the complaint that this has been an issue for not just years, but decades, right? So these people are complaining, I feel, because they felt entitled to recognition, right? In the years before, when they were being lauded, applauded, and whatnot, their movies were coming out, smashing the box office, there was no complaint about the lack of diversity, about the lack of representation, the lack of appreciation for Black contribution. But in the year when they didn't get nominated, they weren't complaining those other years, but suddenly when it's them, it's a problem. There are Black awards, and then you have the more mainstream, or let's say the typically predominantly white awards. So if you think of let's say the Soul Train Awards versus the Grammys or the American Music Awards. I can't remember the name of it, but I happened to watch one year, or I think it might have been BET or TV1 or something like that, where there's this award show made for the Black film industry in recognition that Black people were not being recognized elsewhere. It happens every year, but this year they happen to televise it. It's an opportunity for our community to recognize actors, actresses, and filmmakers. And it was a cool award show. From an economic standpoint, by far there's less Black people in America in comparison to white people or that of other racial and ethnic groups. So success in the Black community is one thing, that's amazing, but achieving success in this broader market could mean greater economic success, more revenue, more money, more things of that nature. So I understand people striving for that, but at the same time, there seems to be a difference in perception of the legitimacy or respect for these awards when it's within the Black industry or the Black community versus the broader community. It's a lot of these award shows like the NAACP awards, the Image Awards, but the Soul Train or the Soul Train Music Awards, BET Awards, things like that, those awards were created because for quite some time, Black artists weren't receiving the same recognition as white and other ethnic groups, like creative people. So those shows were created to celebrate Black people that otherwise might not be celebrated for whatever reasons, right? It might be that they're not deemed as being big enough. They don't have the crossover success. And with regards to the film industry and even the music industry as well, with these award shows, it's once more Black artists started crossing over in film and music, it was kind of deemed as the Black award shows didn't matter as much. You look at them now, right? Consider some of the award shows like the Soul Train Awards and these other awards where in years past, I can remember in the 90s, these huge entertainers like Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson, these international celebrities, your Janet Jacksons, your Mariah Careys, really, really big names would show up at these award shows, right? I mean, they'd also show up at the Grammys and these other places, but they would show up at these Black award shows as well. But then there was kind of a shift that occurred where when mainstream art or when more Black artists became more fixedly mainstream, now when you look at a lot of these award shows, a lot of those big names no longer attend the Black award shows, right? Or these newer entertainers do not. So I understand the economics of it. I understand people trying to appeal to or to make fans of the largest artists, right? To appeal to the largest audience they can reach. In expanding their reach, I recognize this thing of the concept of the white man's ice being colder, right? There's Black success, and then there's success that's recognized by the white community. And one is deemed as being more worthy than the other, which kind of goes back to this thing of white supremacy. It's you might have made it in the Black community, but until you're recognized, accepted, and whatnot, we can argue about that, but within the white society, within white entertainment, it's you haven't quite made it to that level as yet. You're not A-list, right? There's a different tier. On the one hand, it's been years, right, of Black people creating and contributing to these different creative industries, right, with their accomplishments not being fully recognized. I understand the complaints about that. But at the same time, it's Black people aren't really accepted in most facets of society, and you have to be 10 times greater seemingly to get recognition. So it's sort of why are we still fighting for this attention? I'm kind of two minds here where I understand both perspectives. I lean a little to one side, but then lean a little to the other, right? And so this film, it starts off with the celebration, right? At the beginning. And I was having this mental battle with myself as far as, well, what is the right approach to take with these viewpoints, right? Is one correct? And ultimately, I don't have the answer. So the documentary maker then reached back and began discussing where we are now, right? And that there's still a push to go forward, but then taking a step back to discuss where the Black film industry came from. And being about history, that was right up my alley. The movie industry began back in like the first or second decade of the 1900s. And so the film begins its focus on Black film in the late 90s or so, right? With individuals that were around in between like the 1940s to 1960s. Individuals who I think part of it was showing not just Black people in general on screen, but sort of the shaping of the Black image on screen. These individuals within limitations, yes, but at the same time being shown as human beings. Something that's I've always found telling is like in the case of Harry Belafonte, they discussed the movie Carmen, right, which starred Dorothy Dandridge, in which he played her love interest. And it was the first time that a love story of this nature, let's say a passionate romance between Black people, was shown on screen. So this aspect of humanity is shown for the first time. But then also Harry Belafonte, his appearance in the film, I can't remember the name of it, but he had a white woman as his love interest, and the potential for scandal, the industry code that had been developed within the movie industry, which kind of dictated which things could and could not be depicted on screen. And so one of those things was interracial relationships. There was a guy from England where he's shown on screen having a chaste but still romantic relationship with a white woman, and then Harry Belafonte as well. There's also some discussion of Sidney Poitier, right, his early roles where pretty much all of them are presented in contrast to the stereotypes that had been around for generations. They're shown as being like, handsome men, well-dressed, very human. And there's also a discussion of Hattie McDaniel, who I know best for appearing in Gone with the Wind, for which she won a Best Supporting Actress Oscar. I remember the history of it being that she was nominated, yes, but wasn't allowed to. She appeared in the film, but wasn't allowed to appear at the premiere in the South, right? But did attend the Oscars. And it's mentioned that she was like the only Black person in attendance, the only Black person invited to go up on stage. And when she did, the producers of the film, I believe, wrote a script for her. But rightfully, and I respect the move, that she chose to speak her own words. Even with her playing roles that existed within the limitations that were placed on Black actors and actresses of the time, she still brought her own energy to the roles. And although they were like maids or domestic servants and things along those lines, she took them and crafted them in a way to become her own. And so within that, there's discussion of Sidney Poitier and what his portrayal of characters meant to not just Black people viewing our movies, but particularly Black men and future actors. Here was this man with these characters that were fresh and different because they were complex, right? Fully formed with a certain dignity that he carried within himself. In light of these caricatures and stereotypes that had been so often forced upon Black performers, Black characters in films, it's like he was a breath of fresh air. But at the same time, even with this progress, there was still these limitations that in and of itself, playing into respectability politics was limiting, in that it's not enough to be a fully fledged human being with flaws like everyone else, but that you have to be this upstanding paragon of virtue who's perfect in all ways. And in a lot of ways, I'm thinking about quite a number of his roles. Even in instances where they're romantic relationships, they're often devoid of any actual romance, kind of like this straight-jacketed depiction. It's like, you don't have to be that one stereotype, but the alternative is that you portray this person, right, in this other type of person. These expectations deny characters their humanity, their human complexity. It's like either you were the foolish performer, the criminal or something along those lines, or you have to be perfect beyond reproach with no real passion within yourself. And so there's discussion about him winning the Oscar for Lilies of the Field, a film in which his race is mentioned. And that's something else that I think about. Like, when we think about the portrayal of Black people, do we limit ourselves by not recognizing the character's Blackness? Or is that the way that things really should be, where your key identifying factor, who you are as a person, shouldn't be dictated by your race? I don't really know, what's the right answer there. But it was something that I thought about while watching the film. In the movie Lilies of the Field, he's obviously a Black man, and the nuns that he works with are obviously white women, but yet at no point in the film is his race mentioned. And so I found myself thinking about, well, when we have movies with Black people in them, do all of the movies have to be about race? Not to say racism and things like that, but does the Black person's race have to always be mentioned? Does that have to be a part of the plot? Because generally speaking, when I'm around other Black people, I'm just a person. And so I found myself thinking like, what is the right answer there? Is there a right answer? When Diahann Carroll popped up on the screen, I was happy because I love her, right? She's unfortunately passed away in the time since the documentary was made, or released rather. But she's like one of those people from the 60s and 70s era that I just adore. I came to know of Diahann Carroll from watching reruns of A Different World. And I enjoyed them touching on Claudine and the discussion of some of her other roles. So much of the imagery that was put across on screen, the depiction of characters, so actors, actresses, they can only do so much with characters based on what's written in the script. And so you had these stereotypes, and actors and actresses kind of were trying to branch out and play different roles. And so we get into the conversation of where is it that this imagery, that these stereotypes are coming from? And the reality is that for a very long time, Black people were not in control of the films that were being made about Black people. That's not to say that Black people can't direct films with a predominantly white cast, or a white person can't make or direct a film with a predominantly Black cast. But I think because a lot of times when these characters are being written, in the case of white filmmakers, they write Black characters as they think they are, or as they perceive them, right? Based on preconceived notions and prejudices, which is how you end up with these stereotypes and caricatures. Because if you've had limited contact with Black people on just like a regular day-to-day basis, and you don't have regular social relations or whatnot, you'd have a skewed perception of what Black people are like. There's a good chance if you don't go out and take it upon yourself to actually speak to, meet with, and get to really know Black people, you're going to then perpetuate stereotypes that you've been exposed to. And so it just becomes this repeating cycle. Making the conscious choice to take greater control in the characters that are presented and in the movies that are put together, the projects that are created, by like the roles that are taken, but also behind the camera where a lot of the decisions about characters and story and things like that are made, you now have like Robert Townsend. Right. And so he appears and he begins talking about how he got into working behind the camera, where originally he'd started out as an actor and found himself auditioning for Black roles. But the reality is you have a limited number of roles as Black actors and actresses. And then of those limited roles, quite often, a lot of them are stereotypes, especially if we're talking about the 60s and earlier. Roles for mainly maids, butlers. There's nothing wrong with those jobs, but rather that this was kind of like the totality of what was being presented as representative of Black people. Just these handful of characters and stereotypes rather than Black people being portrayed as fully formed human beings or in a wider variety and greater diversity of roles and characters. Imagine if there are like 10 Black films made in a year. One of them might be good, not just from the standpoint of the dialogue, action, production quality, things like that, but actually in terms of how the characters are presented. Having a solid story with Black human beings rather than just Black caricatures. Given the number of actors and actresses in the industry that might want to be in such a film that everyone wants to be in, because there's only going to be so many roles, right? It's like you as an individual might only get to appear in such a movie every once in a while. Working on movie sets as an actor, Townsend realized that Black people weren't choosing to portray the characters in this way, but rather that there were directors, screenwriters, and people writing the lines, giving them direction about how they wanted these lines to be delivered, how they wanted the characters portrayed. And recognizing that, he saw the power of being behind the camera, that in that role he could create more complex imagery by moving behind the camera. And so independently, he made Hollywood Shuffle, which is regarded as being an incredible movie. So following on the heels of this in the mid-80s, right, you then had like the rise of Spike Lee and his contributions to Black film, individuals recognizing the system for what it was, but then as directors and filmmakers taking it upon themselves to kind of create their own projects and to push away those barriers, or attempt to push away and break past those barriers from the outside. So you have Lee's early movies, and his approach to making films was very independent. His movies offered quite a bit of commentary on race and racism in America. I've seen, I think, pretty much all of his movies that were discussed, but I enjoyed the little tidbits behind the scenes of like the making of both School Days and also Malcolm X. So the industry background, more like the industry side of things of how those films came about. So Do the Right Thing, being one of the first films to kind of meld Black filmmaking and hip hop, right? A good point is made about Black culture, or rather the contributions of Black people to American culture, right? Where it's very popular, very celebrated, where at the same time there's this continued thing of racism. As they touch upon, it's like people are willing to accept the art, creativity, culture created by Black people while not necessarily caring for or about Black people themselves. And I thought that was a pretty interesting insight, really on point. So John Singleton is mentioned, right? He mentions that seeing Do the Right Thing in theaters, he went home that very same day and began working on Boys in the Hood. It's kind of like you have this thing of standing on the shoulders of your predecessors or your ancestors. So Spike Lee kind of built on what Robert Townsend created. John Singleton then built on Spike Lee. So they each inspired the next person coming up, right? Not even the next generation, just the next person. And so I think the late 80s to mid 90s was arguably the golden age of Black movies because of the variety of films that you had during that time. And as part of that was this genre, which I would term hood movies, right? In quite a number of these films, the characters aren't the best people. They're violent. The language isn't great. Sometimes there's like misogynistic imagery and ideas, but the characters were complex and the stories were well written. I would make the argument that Martin Scorsese makes films with similar themes and is still regarded as an incredible director. I'm not at all one for censorship. I don't think this is how anyone should aspire to live, but those stories deserve to be told, right? And it's creativity, it's entertainment. My issue is not with these films being told, because obviously, as you can see, I've reviewed many of these films and I think some of them are actually quite good. But the problem that I take with those films, or not so much with those films, but with the industry rather, and the films that they choose to make, is that they'll latch on to one type of film and simplify it to the point, really just strip away any true value and complexity or humanity and make the people into caricatures. And beyond that, the lack of diversity is a problem. It's like they cling on to the most negative stuff and just make it over and over again. So it's like you can have the hood movie, but I think you also need the family film. You can have a movie about slavery, but we also need a love story and a coming of age story. We need greater variety. It's like movies about Black people are either those terrible church movies or about struggle and dysfunction. Where are the good movies about just regular Black people? When's the last time we had a good Love Jones or a family film like Soul Food? If you think of it, like the early 90s were indeed like a second coming of the blaxploitation genre, right? Just updated. But there were an improvement in some ways because a lot of those blaxploitation films, they weren't very good. Often the acting was bad, the dialogue was terrible, and the storylines were ridiculous. Sure, some of the films were independently produced, but as it turns out, quite a number of these films from the 70s were actually made through studios. And they were part of this issue of white people writing Black characters, but not taking the time to understand Black people or the Black experience, rather just making assumptions and going off of stereotypes. Some of them really broke through, as leading up to this, there had been very little representation beyond like maids and butlers, who were often subservient characters. In the 70s, people sat up and took notice of these new characters because they were something different. So looking back on it, maybe I judged them a bit harshly, but I understand why people were attracted to these films. I could see why people like Shaft, Foxy Brown, The Mac, etc. I've watched those movies. Some of them are cool, some of them not so much. There's this thing where even later on in the 90s, with Black movies, hip-hop, etc., when there's some new Black art form where you have like a sort of renaissance period within the Black creative space that moves to the forefront, these larger entities, so film studios, record labels, things like that, they kind of latch onto it. They grab everything that they can and then dump it and the artist when it's no longer deemed as being valuable. So back in the 70s with blaxploitation, film companies made a lot of money. The filmmakers themselves made a lot of money. But instead of taking those funds and reinvesting into making more Black films, some just grabbed the money and ran. I don't think it's a problem for white filmmakers to make movies about Black people, as long as it's coming from an authentic place, and they do the requisite research to make sure that the voices and depiction of the characters are realistic and authentic. Because it's in the same vein that I think Black people can make movies about white people or work with white casts. The last episode touches on the relatively recent occurrence, I would say maybe within like the last decade or so, of Black actors from England appearing in quite a number of American films. I follow movies, good television, and who's appearing in what more so than entertainment in general or the lives of celebrities. I really don't care about celebrities. But I've seen conversations around this topic on different message boards and in reading about film in the industry. I never really looked into celebrities as far as commentary they might have offered about this or like what their viewpoints might have been. But watching it here, where you kind of have these actors and actresses and other people involved in the film industry speaking about this incoherence, instead of it kind of confirming those beliefs, it actually changed my perspective quite a bit, right? Not to say that I don't think Black British actors should be cast in American films, either featuring Black actors or that have predominantly Black casts, but rather that I kind of take issue with the rationale behind it and the mentality that seems to accompany it. As in watching some of the commentary, I got what people were taking issue with. I think if two actors are up for a role of a Black person in a movie where one is British, one is American, whoever best embodies the character during auditions and whatnot, they should get the role. But what it more sounds like is that there's some stereotypes and negative perceptions that play a role in, let's say, the economic dealings. There's a clip with Samuel Jackson where he offers some commentary on this occurrence, which is that he thinks it's a monetary thing. Filmmakers go over to England, they get these actors and actresses that they pay to appear in these films, but for less than what Black American actors and actresses might demand. And I think it's a valid point if it is true, right? Certainly people have to do what they have to start out and when they're trying to survive. But in the long term, you run the risk of damaging things for everyone else when you're willing to undercut what the industry norm might be. It's like with musicians and singers, right? You have people who have popularity in another area of entertainment. Film companies look at them from the perspective of maybe they can bring in some of their audience while not necessarily looking at it as, is this someone that truly understands and has dedicated themselves to the craft of acting, right? It's sort of showing a lack of respect for what's really a talent and skill. The idea that in whatever role you can just pick some random person, drop them into the role, and that's all you need. It devalues the contributions of actors and actresses who truly dedicate themselves to becoming skilled in this craft. And that's what it is. It is a craft. It is a talent. Just slotting random people into these roles where quite often you're telling the stories of Black Americans, I can see people taking an issue with that. Where it's less about this person is the best actor or best actress that we could find versus this person was the cheapest one we could find. You know, it's undercutting Black American actresses and actors here in America. That's even more relevant when you take into consideration that over the course of this documentary, there's a lot of discussion about the difficulties faced throughout the decades by various actors and actresses and the work that had to be put in by Black American actors and actresses, trying to break out of these stereotypes, trying to expand the type of roles that they're offered, trying to get more opportunities. Sacrifice has been made by Black American actors and actresses. And now when it seems like things are starting to look up, you're making some progress, you have people from the outside coming in, showing actually to some degree disrespect and disregard for their contributions. And so I think it's a completely valid concern for people to critique that. My family's from the West Indies, and I've had to get on like some family members about things like this where they either repeat stereotypes or negative perceptions and things like that, assumptions about Black Americans. And it's like, it's disrespectful of the sacrifices and achievements of Black Americans. And so something that I point out is that it's easy for you to come from the outside, for you to be swayed by these images that are sent to you elsewhere in the world. It's ungrateful for you to then come here to America and to be dismissive, disrespectful really, about the sacrifices that Black Americans have made. They've basically laid the groundwork that you're now benefiting from, right? You're benefiting from their sacrifice and hard work, especially because several of the Black British actors explain the difficulties they experience in the British entertainment industry, specifically because they describe the industry as being even more limiting for Black actors. It's easier said than done, but why not replicate and adapt the movement of like Black American actors and actresses by pushing for change on both sides of the camera in Great Britain? The Black diaspora is huge. Why not offering an industry that appeals to the diaspora rather than fighting for acceptance into an industry that doesn't want you? And I say that for both American American and British actors and actresses. To be clear, for the most part, I felt the Black British actors and filmmakers were appreciative of Black American cinema and its history. But something that I took issue with was the commentary offered by Brian White. He was discussing a fictional scenario where a director might be looking for an actor to convey a certain emotion, and the director could go to England and find 10 actors capable of doing it and seemingly struggle to find such a person in America. I don't believe in the idea of tearing down one group or tearing down one person in order to build another up or to give them their props. It's perfectly fine to say, there's been a number of films recently starring Black actors and actresses from England that have featured very, great performances. That's fine. But it's something else to go beyond that, to use that to point the finger at Black American actors and actresses, or to imply that they're somehow lacking talent or dedication. I take issue with that, especially coming from a Black American actor. It's a way of painting oneself as a special snowflake, as though you're unlike the others. He continues making these various points of en masse Black actors and actresses, Black British actors and actresses being more dedicated, disciplined, professional, and things like that in comparison to Black American actors and actresses that I just don't think is true. I don't buy into this thing of appreciating Black American culture, but then speaking down on Black American people. I didn't have an issue with the Black English actors speaking about their experiences, how they got started in the industry, their various roles, or, other people's roles that stood out to them. But I really did take issue with this kind of underlying tone, for lack of a better term, of throwing shade at Black American actors and actresses. To be clear, I understand that because in general, the movie industry around the world is difficult, parts and roles can be few and far between, especially for Black actors and actresses. So I completely understand taking whatever opportunities present themselves to you within reason. But I feel like sometimes we far too easily fall for this thing where two groups of Black people end up fighting over scraps from the table without recognizing that you're probably better off working together, or at least learning from each other and pushing back in your respective areas to get a greater share of the pie, or better yet, working together to build your own table. Instead of fighting amongst each other for these little scraps at the table, why don't you start putting projects together with each other? Sure, there are about 46 million Black people in America and Great Britain combined, but there are an estimated 65 to 120 million people of Black ancestry in Brazil and another 218 million in Nigeria alone, let alone the rest of Africa. Why not include them in the mix as well? Instead of allowing yourselves to be pitted against each other, fighting over the handful of roles that are made available by mainstream Hollywood or the British film industry. I have family members here in New York and older relatives in the West Indies that love Nollywood films. It's pointed out that there have been just a handful of Black women who have directed studio films, though they're somewhat better represented in independent films. Ava DuVernay is featured and she comes to mind. Is it that there's more focus on other areas of production, meaning maybe being in front of the camera or in other positions behind the camera, or is it a lack of opportunity? And then there's also discussion about the lack of representation of members of the LGBT community. And so with that, there's conversation about the incredible film and the making of Moonlight. I thought it was a great film when I saw it when it first came out. And so I enjoyed getting a little bit of insight into how it developed and came about. Overall, I thought this was a really great documentary. I certainly took issue with some aspects of it, but more of a perspective of, I think it's intended to spark debate, not to say that one perspective of the other is right or wrong. The documentary itself I thought was quite good, but I felt like it jumped around a little bit and felt a bit disorganized for me. And given the episode titles, I expected the episodes to focus largely on those topics, but for some, the topic of the title wouldn't really come up for discussion until fairly late into the episode, and it might just be a few minutes. I think the documentary in and of itself is worth checking out on its own, right? But also, if you're a film buff, I think you'll especially enjoy it because you might find some new films to watch or even films that you've already seen but want to revisit. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website about the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more movie recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.